Breanna Stewart didn't walk off the court. She didn't announce she was quitting. She didn't even say she was done with Unrivaled. But the moment she walked out holding that sign, something far bigger than one player, one league, or one controversy quietly snapped. Because what happened next wasn't outrage. It wasn't backlash. It wasn't even debate. It was silence. The kind of silence that only happens when people were already gone. For weeks, Unrivaled had been telling a story about growth, about momentum, about being the future, about being the leveraged WNBA players needed to finally force real change. The alternative, the pressure point, the backup plan. And then, in a single weekend, the numbers came in and told a completely different story. Not a bad story. Not a disappointing story. A brutal one. Ratings so low they didn't just underperform, they barely existed. Games aired on national television that failed to register at all. A league that was supposed to be building power instead exposed how fragile it really was. And here's the part almost everyone missed. Breanna Stewart didn't cause this. She revealed it. Because Unrivaled wasn't collapsing because of politics or protests or angry comments online. It was collapsing because it never had the audience it needed to survive in the first place. And once that reality became impossible to hide, everything else started falling apart at once. But to understand why this moment mattered so much, and why the damage may already be irreversible, you have to look at what was happening before Breanna Stewart ever held up that sign. Because the warning signs were already there. And they were impossible to ignore. Before the controversy, before the headlines, before anyone was arguing about signs, statements, or intent, Unrivaled already had a problem. A viewership problem. And not the kind you fix with marketing or patience. The kind that tells you the foundation itself is unstable. Going into that weekend, Unrivaled games were already pulling numbers that would make most television executives nervous. Not because they were trending down, but because there was almost nowhere left to fall from. On Friday night, games aired on TNT, a major national network, not a streaming experiment, not a late-night rerun slot. And they pulled around 30,000 viewers in the key 18 to 49 demographic. That number matters more than people realize. Because in cable television, the demo isn't just a stat. It's the currency. It's how networks decide what survives and what quietly disappears. And when your demo number is that low, the total audience, even on a good night, barely clears 100,000 viewers. That's not growth stage struggle. That's emergency-level concern. And yet, almost no one noticed. Why? Because the audience was already so small that losing some of them didn't feel dramatic. There was no massive drop-off because there was no massive base to begin with. The league wasn't hemorrhaging viewers. It was operating on fumes. Saturday didn't improve things. More games. More exposure. Same story. Numbers hovering at levels that place your broadcast near the bottom of cable rankings, competing not with other sports, but with reruns, niche programming, and background television people leave on by accident. And here's the most important detail that rarely gets discussed. These games weren't hidden. They weren't inaccessible. They weren't buried on obscure platforms. They were right there. And people still weren't watching. That's when the real concern should have set in. Because low ratings in year one can be explained. Low ratings during a novelty phase can be forgiven. Low ratings while curiosity is still fresh are survivable. But low ratings after curiosity has worn off? That's when things get dangerous. Unrivaled already had its first season. People knew what it was. They understood the format. They had seen the production quality. They had decided, consciously or not, whether this was something they wanted to make time for. And the answer week after week was increasingly clear. Most didn't. That's why the controversy didn't break the league. It exposed how little room for error there actually was. Because when your entire audience fits into a narrow slice of highly engaged fans, any disruption, political, cultural, or otherwise, doesn't cause a wave. It causes collapse. And the league didn't have the depth, reach, or casual viewer base to absorb even a mild shock. That's the part that gets ignored when people focus only on the protest. The ratings didn't crash from the top. They slid off the edge. And once you're at that level, the margin between struggling and not registering at all is razor thin. Which brings us to what happened next. Because when Monday night arrived, the numbers didn't just confirm the problem. They made it impossible to deny. And that's where Unrivaled crossed a line most leagues never recover from. But that wasn't the whole story. When Breanna Stewart walked out for warm-ups holding that sign, it didn't land in a vacuum. That detail matters. Because if Unrivaled had been thriving, if it had momentum, if it had a growing casual audience, the moment would have sparked debate, not damage. There would have been segments arguing both sides. Social media noise. Maybe even a short-term ratings bump driven by controversy curiosity. That's what happens when a league has oxygen. But Unrivaled didn't. What Stewart did instantly became something else entirely, a stress test. Not of politics, not of ideology, but of audience loyalty. Within hours, reactions poured in, not from millions of casual viewers, but from the same small core that had been carrying the league from the start. And that's when the cracks widened. Because this wasn't just a message people disagreed with. It was a reminder that Unrivaled was asking its audience to show up for more than basketball, at a moment when most of them were already questioning why they were showing up at all. Timing is everything in sports. And the timing here could not have been worse. The protest came just days after a nationally discussed criminal case had concluded, one that had already turned immigration into a raw emotional issue across the country. The case was fresh. Emotions were high. Lines were already drawn. And Unrivaled, a league struggling to convince casual fans to care, suddenly found itself attached to a conversation far bigger than it could control. Stewart later explained her intent. She framed it as advocacy, as a call for compassion, as a statement about policies rather than people. But intent stopped mattering the second the league's ratings became part of the story. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Most sports fans don't tune in for alignment. They tune in for escape. They want competition. They want storylines that stay inside the lines. They want reasons to come back next week. And Unrivaled had not yet earned the kind of loyalty that allows a league to challenge its audience and survive the fallout. Instead, the protest forced viewers to make a choice. Not about the issue. About whether they wanted to keep investing time in a league that already felt optional. And when Monday came, the answer showed up in the most unforgiving place possible. The ratings. What followed wasn't a dramatic collapse in the traditional sense. There was no massive drop from millions to hundreds of thousands. There was no headline-friendly free fall. Because there was nothing that high to fall from. Instead, what happened was far more alarming. The audience didn't argue. They didn't protest. They didn't tune in to hate watch. They simply disappeared. And when the numbers came back, they revealed something chilling. The backlash only cost the league about 10 to 15,000 viewers in the demo. Maybe 40 to 60,000 total viewers at most. In any established league, that kind of drop would be noise. In Unrivaled's case, it was catastrophic. Because it confirmed that the league's total reachable audience was never much bigger than that to begin with. This wasn't a mass rejection. It was exposure. The controversy didn't shrink a massive fanbase. It showed how small the fanbase already was. And once that became clear, the conversation shifted. Suddenly, this wasn't about whether Breanna Stewart should or shouldn't have made a statement. It was about whether Unrivaled could survive any statement at all. Because leagues don't die from controversy. They die from indifference. And indifference is exactly what the numbers suggested. That's why the league's leadership stayed quiet. That's why there was no confident pushback, no aggressive reframing, no attempt to own the moment. Because when your audience is that thin, every move risks pushing you below the threshold of visibility. And that's the danger zone. The place where networks start asking questions they don't want to ask publicly. The place where investors stop talking about potential and start talking about timelines. The place where a league stops being evaluated as a vision and starts being evaluated as a line item. And Unrivaled crossed into that zone the moment the ratings told the truth. But even that wasn't the worst part. Because as bad as Friday and Saturday looked, Monday didn't just confirm the problem. It turned it into a crisis. A crisis so severe that one of Unrivaled's games didn't just underperform. It didn't exist. And that's when the story changed forever. Monday night was supposed to stabilize things. That's usually how these moments go. A controversy flares up, emotions cool, curiosity pulls some viewers back in, and the numbers normalize just enough for everyone to pretend the problem wasn't as serious as it looked. Unrivaled needed Monday. What it got instead was a nightmare scenario no league ever wants attached to its name. Because when the ratings came in, one of the games didn't just perform poorly. It didn't register. Not low. Not disappointing. Not below expectations. It showed up as NA. And unless you understand what that means in television terms, it's hard to grasp how severe that actually is. NA doesn't mean nobody watched. It means so few people watched that Nielsen couldn't generate a statistically meaningful number. In other words, the audience was so small it fell below the threshold of measurement. This wasn't a streaming glitch. This wasn't a reporting delay. This wasn't a late-night overflow slot. This was a professional basketball game aired on TNT, one of the biggest sports networks in the country, that effectively did not exist in the ratings ecosystem. That's not a bad night. That's a red alert. To put it in perspective, this wasn't a random preseason exhibition. This wasn't a tape-delayed replay. This was a scheduled, promoted game in a league that had just signed a multi-year media deal worth millions. And yet, when the numbers came back, the system couldn't even tell you how many people were watching because the sample size was that thin. That's the moment everything changes. Because networks don't panic over controversy. They panic over invisibility. A controversial game still draws attention. It still creates data. It still shows up on charts, even if the reactions are negative. But a game that doesn't register? That tells executives something far more dangerous. It tells them the product isn't breaking through at all. The first game that night pulled around 50,000 viewers in the demo, which on the surface looked like an improvement. But even that number ranked near the bottom of cable programming for the night. And when you scale that out, you're still talking about a total audience that barely cracks 200,000 viewers for a primetime TNT broadcast. That's not competitive. That's a rounding error. And then came the second game, the one that vanished. No ranking, no meaningful share, no footprint. Just empty space where a professional league was supposed to be. That's when Unrivaled stopped being evaluated as a growth project and started being evaluated as a liability. Because at that level, it's not about patience anymore. It's about justification. Every network deal comes with an unspoken expectation, visibility. You don't need to win the night, but you need to exist within it. And Unrivaled failed that test. This is the part fans rarely see. Behind the scenes, ratings reports aren't just glanced at, they're dissected, compared, projected, cross-referenced against cost, production value, and opportunity cost. And when a program doesn't register, the question becomes brutally simple. Why is this here? Why are we allocating a primetime slot, production resources, and brand association to something that barely anyone is watching? That question doesn't get asked out loud at first. But once it enters the room, it never leaves. And suddenly, the protest stopped being the headline. The ratings became the story. Because the ratings didn't just say the league was struggling. They said the league had almost no margin for survival. Which leads to the most damaging realization of all. Unrivaled wasn't just failing to grow. It was failing to justify its own existence on television. And that realization didn't just affect the league. It completely changed the power dynamic for the players who were counting on Unrivaled to be something more than just an experiment. Because once a league can't draw viewers, it can't apply pressure. And once it can't apply pressure, it stops being leverage. It becomes a cautionary tale. And that's where the conversation shifts from ratings to something much bigger. Because Unrivaled wasn't just a league. It was supposed to be a threat, a backup plan, a bargaining chip. And after Monday night, that illusion was gone. But that wasn't even the most dangerous part. The most dangerous part was what this meant for the WNBA negotiations happening right now. Because if your alternative can't survive on national television, then threatening to walk away stops being a strategy. It becomes a bluff. And bluffs get called. That's when Unrivaled stopped being a solution and started becoming a problem. From the very beginning, Unrivaled wasn't just marketed as another league. It was framed as leverage, a pressure point, a quiet threat sitting in the background while WNBA players pushed for a better deal. The message was simple, even if it was never said out loud. If the WNBA didn't move far enough, fast enough, players had options. They could walk. They could shift attention. They could take their talent and their audience somewhere else. Unrivaled was supposed to be proof that those options were real. And for a brief moment, it worked. Just the existence of an alternative league changed the conversation. Owners had to acknowledge it. Media had to take it seriously. The idea that players could build value outside the WNBA created leverage that hadn't existed before. But leverage only works if the threat behind it is credible. And credibility, in sports, comes down to one thing. Audience. If fans follow you, you have power. If they don't, you don't. That's why Monday night mattered so much. Because the moment a nationally televised, unrivaled game failed to register in the ratings, the entire leverage narrative collapsed. Not slowly. Instantly. You can't threaten to leave when the place you're threatening to go can't draw 50,000 viewers. You can't negotiate revenue sharing by pointing to a league that networks are quietly questioning. And you can't claim bargaining power when your supposed alternative looks less like competition and more like a financial experiment burning cash. This is the part players didn't want to confront. Unrivaled didn't just struggle. It weakened their negotiating position at the worst possible time. WNBA-CBA discussions aren't theoretical right now. They're happening. Proposals are on the table. Numbers are being debated. Percentages are being fought over. And leverage matters more in those rooms than passion ever will. The league offered increased salaries and benefits. Players pushed back, demanding a larger share of total revenue. The argument was about fairness, growth, and long-term value. But every negotiation has an unspoken question behind it. What happens if we say no? Before Monday, Unrivaled was part of that answer. After Monday, it wasn't. Because once Unrivaled showed it couldn't hold an audience, it stopped being a viable escape route. It became proof of dependency. Suddenly, the WNBA wasn't negotiating with players who had options. It was negotiating with players who needed the league far more than they wanted to admit. And that shift changes everything. Leverage isn't about making noise. It's about making decision-makers nervous. And nothing makes ownership more comfortable than watching your opponent's backup plan implode on national television. This is why the fallout went far beyond Breanna Stewart. Her protest didn't just create controversy. It accelerated a timeline that players were counting on. Because Unrivaled was supposed to grow quietly in the background while negotiations played out. It was supposed to become more stable, more visible, more credible over time. Instead, it peaked too early and exposed its weaknesses too publicly. And once that happened, the power dynamic snapped back into place. Owners could afford to wait. Networks could afford to hesitate. And players suddenly found themselves negotiating without the safety net they believed they had. That's the danger of building leverage on something unproven. When it works, it feels revolutionary. When it fails, it collapses everything attached to it. And Unrivaled didn't just fail to strengthen the player's hand. It weakened it. Which brings us to the next problem that made this collapse even faster. Because even before the ratings disaster, Unrivaled was already bleeding something it couldn't afford to lose. Its stars. And when the biggest names start quietly opting out, it sends a message louder than any protest ever could. Before the ratings collapse. Before the protest backlash. Before Monday night exposed everything. Unrivaled had already taken a hit it never fully recovered from. Its biggest stars didn't come back. Angel Reese gone. Sabrina Ionescu gone. No dramatic announcement. No public fallout. No headlines screaming disaster. Just absence. And in sports, absence speaks louder than statements. Because when a league is new, every returning star sends a signal of confidence. It tells fans the experience is worth it. It tells sponsors the product has pull. It tells investors this isn't just a passion project. It's a place elite players believe in. But when those stars quietly opt out, it sends a very different message. It raises questions nobody wants to ask out loud. Was the money not worth it? Was the schedule not worth the risk? Was the exposure not delivering what was promised? Or was the league simply not essential? Angel Reese didn't frame her decision as a rejection. She focused on other ventures. Branding, business, visibility beyond the court. That alone should have been a warning. Because Unrivaled was supposed to be a place where players built their brand, not stepped away from it to protect something bigger. And Sabrina Ionescu's absence cut even deeper. She wasn't just a star. She was credibility. A bridge between casual fans and hardcore supporters. A player with crossover appeal who could pull in viewers who didn't already live inside women's basketball discourse. When someone like that chooses not to return, it changes perception immediately. Not just among fans. Among networks. Among sponsors. Among investors. Because if the league can't convince its most valuable assets to keep showing up, why should anyone else commit long-term? Unrivaled tried to replace that loss with other names. Breanna Stewart became a central figure. Other respected players filled out rosters. The talent level on the court was still high. But star power isn't just about skill. It's about draw. And losing Reese and Ionescu stripped Unrivaled of the kind of magnetism a young league desperately needs. This wasn't the NBA. where one or two absences don't matter. This was a startup. Every recognizable face counted. Every returning name reassured viewers that the league was moving forward, not treading water. Instead, the opposite happened. Before the season even settled in, the narrative shifted quietly from excitement to uncertainty. People stopped asking, "What is this becoming?" and started asking, "Is this worth keeping up with?" That question is deadly. Because once a league becomes optional, it becomes forgettable. And forgettable leagues don't survive on television. This is why the ratings collapse wasn't sudden. It was cumulative. Curiosity faded. Star power thinned. Habit never formed. So when controversy finally hit, there was nothing holding casual viewers in place. No loyalty. No routine. No emotional investment strong enough to override discomfort. That's why the protest didn't spark debate-driven viewership. It accelerated disengagement. Because people who were already on the fence didn't need a reason to leave. They just needed a moment that reminded them they didn't have to stay. And once they left, the league had no mechanism to bring them back. Which brings us to the number Unrivaled kept pointing to as proof of success. The number that sounded impressive until you actually broke it down. The $40 million. Because when you understand where that money really came from, the entire illusion collapses. And that's where the financial reality becomes impossible to ignore. On paper, it looked impressive. $40 million in revenue. Second season. Growth narrative. Headlines ready-made for optimism. Unrivaled pointed to that number as proof the league was moving in the right direction. Proof that the model worked, that momentum was real, that critics were exaggerating the struggles. But numbers don't mean anything until you ask one simple question. Where did the money actually come from? Because once you break that $40 million down, the story changes completely. A massive portion of that revenue didn't come from ticket sales. It didn't come from merchandise. It didn't come from organic fan demand. It came from one place. The TNT media rights deal. Roughly $16 million tied to a contract that sounds stable until you read the fine print. A multi-year deal with options built in. Options that allow the network to walk away or renegotiate if the product doesn't deliver. That means nearly half of Unrivaled's reported revenue came from a single source. And the rest? Investor money. Not basketball-generated income. Not proof of demand. Not sustainability. Just capital. Checks written on belief, not returns. And belief has a shelf life. Investors don't fund leagues forever because they like the idea. They fund them because they expect growth, real growth, not press release growth. They expect expanding audiences. They expect improving metrics. They expect signs that the product is becoming essential, not optional. But when ratings are sliding instead of climbing, that expectation collapses. Here's the part that doesn't get said enough. Investor money isn't revenue in the way fans think about revenue. It's fuel. And fuel only matters if you're moving forward. If you're standing still, or worse, sliding backward, it just burns faster. Unrivaled's costs didn't disappear just because the revenue number looked big. Player salaries across multiple teams. Facility rental in a premium market. Production costs for every broadcast. Marketing, operations, staffing, logistics. The TNT money covered a chunk. The rest was being eaten by expenses. Which means that $40 million wasn't a profit signal. It was a survival signal. And survival isn't something you can sell forever. At some point, investors stop asking, "How big can this get?" and start asking, "When does this turn around?" That's when patience runs out. That's when leagues get evaluated not on vision, but on viability. And that's why Monday night mattered so much. Because the moment a nationally televised game fails to register in the ratings, the financial narrative collapses. Suddenly, that $40 million doesn't look like growth. It looks like risk. It looks like money being poured into something that isn't building a base. And that's when the conversation behind closed doors changes tone. No more long-term optimism. No more benefit of the doubt. No more it's still early. Just math. And math is ruthless. If the league can't grow its audience, it can't justify its costs. If it can't justify its costs, it can't keep investor confidence. And if investor confidence cracks, everything else follows. This is why the ratings disaster wasn't just embarrassing. It was expensive. Because every weak number shortens the runway. Every non-registering game turns belief into skepticism. And every skeptical investor is one step closer to pulling back. Which leads directly to the next danger Unrivaled is facing. Because even if investors hesitate, the real power sits somewhere else entirely, with the network. And once you understand what's happening with TNT and its parent company, the clock starts ticking much faster. Because Unrivaled isn't just fighting for viewers. It's fighting for relevance inside a media company that may soon have very different priorities. Unrivaled's biggest problem isn't just low ratings. It's who those ratings belong to. Because once a league ties its future to a major network, it stops being judged on potential and starts being judged on performance. Not in isolation, but in comparison to everything else that network could be airing instead. And that's where TNT enters the story in a way that makes Unrivaled's situation far more fragile than most people realize. The $16 million media deal sounds like security. It sounds like validation. It sounds like a commitment. But buried inside that deal is flexibility. Options, review points, exit paths. Networks build these in for a reason. They know that early enthusiasm doesn't always translate into long-term success. And when a product stops justifying its slot, networks don't hesitate, they reevaluate. Here's what makes this timing brutal. TNT's parent company, Warner Bros. Discovery, is in the middle of major transition. Asset reviews, sale discussions, strategic reshuffling. And when companies go through moments like that, every contract gets looked at with fresh eyes. Not emotionally, financially. New leadership doesn't care about narratives that sounded good 2 years ago. They care about what delivers now, and what can be cut without consequences. That puts Unrivaled in an impossible position. Because even if TNT doesn't publicly walk away early, and the optics of abandoning a women's sports league would be messy, renegotiation becomes almost inevitable if ratings don't improve. And renegotiation is just a polite word for leverage shifting. Once the network has leverage, the league loses it. Less favorable terms, less promotion, less priority, worse time slots. And that creates a feedback loop that's almost impossible to escape. Lower exposure leads to lower ratings. Lower ratings justify lower investment. Lower investment makes growth impossible. That's how leagues quietly disappear. Not with announcements, with scheduling changes. This is why the NA rating was such a disaster. It didn't just look bad. It handed the network proof. Proof that Unrivaled wasn't delivering value relative to its cost. And networks don't need many examples like that before they start planning exits. The real danger isn't TNT pulling the plug overnight. It's TNT letting the league slowly fade. Because that kind of exit doesn't cause outrage. It causes indifference. And indifference is easier to defend than controversy. Which is why Unrivaled now finds itself racing against a clock it doesn't control. Ratings need to improve dramatically, not slightly, to change the narrative. But growth takes time. And time is the one thing this league doesn't have. Because every week that passes without momentum makes the next evaluation harsher. Every report that shows stagnation makes the next negotiation colder. And every quiet internal discussion makes the league's future less certain. That's why the protest became symbolic. Not because it was the cause, but because it happened at the exact moment the league could least afford attention for the wrong reasons. The margin for error was already gone. And once a league reaches that point, even good decisions feel risky. Which brings us to the uncomfortable reality no one wants to say out loud. Breanna Stewart didn't become the face of this collapse because she deserved to. She became the face of it because the league needed one. Because when systems fail, people look for symbols. And Unrivaled had just handed them one. But the real story isn't about blame. It's about inevitability. And once inevitability sets in, the only question left is what happens next. Because the timeline from here isn't measured in years. It's measured in months. And that leads directly to the moment where Unrivaled stops being discussed as a comeback story and starts being discussed as a warning. Breanna Stewart never asked to be the symbol of Unrivaled's collapse. That's important to say. Because symbols aren't chosen based on fairness. They're chosen based on timing. And when systems fail, people instinctively look for a moment they can point to and say, that's when it broke. For Unrivaled, that moment became the protest. Not because it destroyed the league, but because it arrived right when the league could no longer hide its weakness. If the ratings had been strong, the moment would have passed. If the audience had been deep, the backlash would have been absorbed. If the league had momentum, controversy would have fueled attention instead of draining it. But Unrivaled had none of those things. So the protest didn't spark a debate, it exposed fragility. And once fragility is visible, perception changes instantly. Suddenly, everything gets reinterpreted. Low ratings stop being early growing pains and start looking like rejection. Investor funding stops looking like confidence and starts looking like life support. Silence from leadership stops looking strategic and starts looking scared. That's how narratives flip. And once they flip, they're almost impossible to reverse. Breanna Stewart became the face of that flip because she was visible, because she was respected, because she was central to the league's identity. That's how symbols work. They aren't villains. They're placeholders for something much bigger. The uncomfortable truth is that Unrivaled needed someone to absorb the story. Because a league collapsing due to structural failure is too abstract, too boring, too complicated. But a league collapsing after a moment? That's something people understand. That's something networks can summarize. That's something fans can argue about. That's something headlines can frame. And so the story became about one sign instead of 1,000 quiet decisions that led there. But behind the scenes, nobody who mattered believed that sign was the real cause. Executives don't think like fans. Investors don't think like commentators. Networks don't think like activists or critics. They think in terms of risk. And what they saw wasn't a controversial player. They saw a league with no buffer. No buffer for controversy. No buffer for political noise. No buffer for mistakes. And once that realization sets in, confidence drains fast. Because a league without buffer is a league one bad week away from irrelevance. This is why recovery narratives are already being questioned. It's not that Unrivaled can't technically continue. It's that continuing may no longer make sense. The format still works. The production is still solid. The talent is still real. But those things don't matter if nobody is watching. And that's the part people avoid saying out loud. Because it's easier to argue about moments than to admit a market might not exist at the scale promised. Which brings us to the final stage of this story. Not what happened, but what happens next. Because the future of Unrivaled is no longer open-ended. It's narrowing. And the timeline ahead doesn't leave room for optimism built on hope alone. It leaves room only for outcomes. And once you map those outcomes, one thing becomes painfully clear. This league isn't fighting for relevance anymore. It's fighting for survival. And that's a very different battle. From this point forward, Unrivaled's future isn't abstract. It's scheduled. There are dates attached to it. Quiet checkpoints where decisions will be made whether the public hears about them or not. The first one comes fast. March. That's when conversations around media commitments start to harden. Not publicly. Internally. Ratings are reviewed not in isolation, but as trends. And trends don't lie. If Unrivaled's numbers don't show meaningful improvement, not marginal bumps, but real momentum, the narrative inside the network changes permanently. At that point, the league isn't viewed as something that will grow. It's viewed as something that might not be worth saving. And when that shift happens, everything slows down. Promotion gets quieter. Prime slots get reconsidered. Support becomes minimal. Not because anyone wants to sabotage the league, but because networks don't invest in uncertainty. Then comes summer. WNBA-CBA negotiations will be reaching their most critical stage. Players will be pushing. Owners will be calculating. And leverage will matter more than passion ever could. But Unrivaled's leverage story is already unraveling. Because threatening to walk away only works if there's somewhere credible to go. And if Unrivaled is limping through the year with stagnant or declining viewership, it stops being an alternative. It becomes a warning. At that point, the WNBA isn't negotiating under pressure. It's negotiating from stability. And stability almost always wins. Then comes the longest shadow of all. January. Another season would theoretically begin. But that word, theoretically, is doing a lot of work. Because leagues don't shut down in dramatic press conferences. They don't announce failure the way fans imagine. They simply stop making sense to fund. Investors hesitate. Networks deprioritize. Momentum dies quietly. And suddenly, there isn't a third season to plan for. Not because anyone officially pulled the plug, but because no one was willing to keep writing checks. This is the part people underestimate. Sports leagues don't need scandals to die. They need indifference. And indifference is exactly what the ratings are signaling. Which makes this whole situation tragic in a way that gets lost in the noise. Because Unrivaled had potential. The format worked. The production quality was real. The talent level was undeniable. 3-on-3 basketball with elite players can work as a niche product. But niche products don't survive by pretending they're revolutions. They survive by growing patiently, managing expectations, and protecting the small audience they have. Unrivaled did the opposite. It scaled pressure faster than it scaled demand. It accepted a media deal that forced performance before habit was built. And it never created enough space between itself and controversy to absorb a hit. So when the moment came, the sign, the backlash, the ratings, everything collapsed at once. Not because of one decision, but because of dozens of small ones that led there. Which leaves one final question. Not about Breanna Stewart. Not about protests. Not even about Unrivaled itself. But about what this means going forward. Because leagues like this don't just disappear. They leave lessons behind. And ignoring those lessons is how the next version makes the same mistakes. So where does this actually leave Unrivaled? Not dead, but exposed. Exposed as a league that needed patience and got pressure. Exposed as leverage that wasn't ready to be tested. Exposed as a product that mistook belief for demand. Breanna Stewart didn't quit. But the numbers told a story that quitting might not be necessary. Because when an audience stops showing up, the decision gets made for you. The real question isn't whether Unrivaled can recover. It's whether anyone involved still believes the recovery is worth funding. Because right now, this league isn't fighting critics. It's fighting math. And math doesn't care about intentions, messaging, or potential. It cares about viewers. And viewers have been quietly voting with their remotes. So what happens next? Does TNT ride it out and hope for a miracle? Do investors double down or start pulling back? Do WNBA players rethink how much leverage they actually have? Or does Unrivaled become the cautionary tale it was never supposed to be? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this conversation isn't going away. And if you want honest, no-fluff breakdowns of what's really happening in women's basketball, hit subscribe. Because the stories everyone avoids, those are the ones we're just getting started on.